You're tuned in to The Last Radio Show.
Hello and welcome to The Last Radio Show. I'm John Lynch.
I'm Jenn Reilly.
And this is the show where we talk about all kinds of stuff. We talk about news, history, pop culture, whatever we feel like. And this kind of combines all of them into one.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about those darn elite Hollywood celebrities that are ruining everything. You know?
Oh, okay.
You know, they're running the world and they're telling us what to think, and they're just being evil. Those Hollywood celebrities,
right.
And those music singers, and all those people. You know, they're all doing things. And what inspired me to talk about this is, I think it was last week. Bruce Springsteen was doing a concert over in England. Yes. Now, Bruce is the boss.
Right.
but the guy who is the president right now didn't like too much what the boss had to say. Mm-hmm. Bruce Springsteen, pretty liberal, I think is fair to say.
For sure.
Definitely. And not a fan of Donald Trump.
Right.
And so in his concert, and if you've ever seen Bruce Springsteen in concert, or if you've ever listened to Bruce Springsteen, concert records, he does do these rambling monologues sometimes where he just kind of lets it all hang out and talks about whatever he feels like. And he did a rather long, lengthy diatribe of Donald Trump and his opinion of his policy. Mm-hmm. And Donald Trump was a little annoyed by this. And
how does word get to Donald Trump? I mean, I know it's pretty easy, but I'm just curious as to the track that it takes.
It is stunning when you see him. And, it's not Twitter, it's his own thing. The Truth Social, his own social media thing, where randomly he'll just start replying back to celebrities or newspaper people or just anybody who criticizes him. Mm-hmm. And it is very much, a 6-year-old on a schoolyard getting angry because somebody's making fun of them.
And it's not a reply to like a direct reply. It's like he heard something, and then it's like a podium or a soapbox.
Then he usually resorts to calling the person names. And he did actually refer to Bruce Springsteen as highly overrated and dumb as a rock. Oh. And he called him a shriveled up prune and over the hill. And Bruce Springsteen is 3 years younger than Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has been compared to fruits before in his appearance. So, he's got the whole, orange and pumpkin head thing kind of going on there. Mm-hmm. So maybe not the angle he wanted to go to start like a feud with Bruce Springsteen.
Now did Bruce reply? Because I haven't been following.
Not really. I mean, he just basically, what is kind of interesting is he did put out the concert like for download, so people could actually, if you weren't at the concert, you could download it and listen to it.
He doubled down on it.
He kind of doubled down on it, so it's out as an EP. You can Land of Hopes and Dreams is the name of his tour, and they included the recording where he made the speech about Trump's policy. Of course, this is not the first time Springsteen has made comments on Trump or comments in general. Mm-hmm. He put out a song in the late 90s called American Skin, 41 Shots. That was about the shooting of Amadou Diallo. He was shot by police officers. Mm-hmm. It was a whole horrible thing where they thought he was a crook and he wasn't. And they thought he was bringing a gun, but he was just taking out his wallet to show his ID, and they shot him. And it was this whole big thing, and a lot of people didn't like that he was going against the police, and they thought he should be boycotted from New York. Right. It was a whole big thing, but this is nothing new. I mean, celebrities have been doing this for a long time. So when you think of like a celebrity who speaks out, who's the first person who comes to mind for you?
Well, historically, I feel like Jane Fonda was the first person I remember for getting like in trouble for it. Yeah. I don't know. I was young, and I remember like, oh, she did something. She's anti-American. Right. I don't know what it was. I think it was obviously protesting the Vietnam War. Right. But that's the first one I remember.
Yeah, that I think is when really a lot of this started, although there are some cases we'll talk about earlier than that. Mm-hmm. But I think during the Vietnam War, of course, musically, a lot of musicians out there, most famously John Lennon and Yoko Ono, protested the Vietnam War. And so John and Yoko did the Bed In for Peace. Mm-hmm. And if you see interviews with John Lennon at the time, he talks about how, the press is just following me anyway, and they're recording everything I do. So I want what I do to mean something.
Okay.
So he's like, if people will listen to me and say, like, maybe this is wrong, maybe if I can get this positive message out and do some good with this celebrity kind of thing, that might actually, the crazier stuff we do, the more people will pay attention. So, and John and Yoko did some crazy stuff.
Yeah.
They stayed in bed for a week in Toronto, very famously, and they recorded the song Give Peace a Chance in bed, and with a bunch of other people just hanging out in their hotel room.
Right.
And, people thought they were kind of, maybe it was a little naive too, but, they thought they were doing something. And, years later, we still remember it.
Well, when you have that much attention, it's like a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, you feel like, okay, I have this stage, I can, proclaim the indecency of the world. But then again, part of the reason I think that he was shot, in the crazy person's mind is that they thought he sold out. So it was like this whole kind of,
absolutely.
This is who you are, but you're a sellout. So it's hard for celebrities, I think, to speak out and be, without being ridiculed.
Right. Or to, have a backlash.
Critical. Yeah.
Definitely have, and you mentioned Jane Fonda, and she was protesting against the Vietnam War, and she actually went to Hanoi, which was northern Vietnam. They called her Hanoi Jane. That was her nickname, and she actually met with the people we were fighting.
Right.
So that's where the traitor thing came off.
Right.
And there's some famous pictures of her, sitting on a gun, wearing a helmet. And, these were people who were fighting American troops. So it was not a good look.
War, yeah.
And she was trying to say these people are people too, which is true. And, we were probably unjust in the war and all this. But it didn't play too well. It's interesting with Jane Fonda, of course. She is Henry Fonda's daughter, who is, old school Hollywood.
Yeah.
Probably as old school Hollywood as you could get.
Right.
But then her brother, Peter Fonda, was in Easy Rider, and he was kind of known as a rebel kind of guy, too.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting that the family dynamic there. And then a relatively short time after all that, she started doing exercise videos.
Everyone sort of forgot.
And everyone sort of forgot. And she's still around as of recording now. She's still out there doing doing popular stuff, doing TV shows and everything with Lily Tomlin. She had a TV show recently that was very popular, and she's does movies where she plays like kind of an old lady kind of now, because she was, getting up there in years.
Now, is she still speaking out? I don't really know. I mean, not really. I think
not as much as she used to. Not as much as she used to.
She stays in her lane.
And, there's the saying, just shut up and sing. Just shut up and act. Just shut up and do, whatever it is you do. Another big-time celebrity who was one of the biggest celebrities in the world was Muhammad Ali. And he was protesting against the Vietnam War, and he actually refused. He was drafted and refused to join the army. And said it was because of religious reasons, and his because he converted to Muslim, he didn't feel that he was part of this. And he was actually stripped of his heavyweight championship at one point. The boxing commission said, you're no longer the champion, even though, he didn't lose a fight. He just, they took it away from him. Years later, he was forgiven. And, again, there comes a point relatively quickly after these things happen. It seems like everybody's just like, you know what? We still like him.
Exactly.
She still does good movies. He's still a good boxer. He still sings good songs. So I'm just not going to worry about that we don't agree politically.
And people have shorter memories now, I think, than they used to, right?
Yes.
It's like you forget yesterday
definitely.
what happened. What did they say?
But more modern celebrities, George Clooney has been very outspoken about a lot of things. And, there is this whole connection that these celebrities are friends with political figures now.
Yeah.
A lot of these people would say they're friends with, George Clooney spoke to Joe Biden about stepping down from the election last year.
Right.
I mean, that's
right. That's right. And he wrote a letter, right? Didn't he write a letter, an open letter to him?
I believe so, and I mean,
they're
think
involved.
About that. That's about as involved as you can get. Telling the guy who's the president of the United States that he should not run for re-election.
Yeah,
I mean, that's as direct as you can get. Very famously, Sean Penn, another outspoken actor, probably better known for his political stuff now than his acting. I mean, it doesn't seem like he does much acting anymore.
Yeah,
and he's very hands-on. He will go to the Congo and like try and like
Sure,
help people
yeah.
and stuff. You know, he's an interesting case. Susan Sarandon,
Yes, that's another one I remember.
Yep.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of people, she was one of the people in 2016 who was, you know, liberal, but didn't support Hillary Clinton. She was a Bernie supporter, Bernie Sanders, and said like, you know what, I can't vote for Hillary. And then obviously that led to Donald Trump becoming president, which was even more extreme than anything Hillary could have done to the right, obviously. And it was, you know, maybe she did more harm than good.
Right, but you know, then it's like weird because can they share their opinion or like a protest is different than an opinion. It's like they're like Taylor Swift, you know, that she shared her opinion. That was huge.
Right.
Like,
and she was kind of forced into it because, you know, Donald Trump retweeted on, and we're not just picking on Donald Trump, but we're picking on him a little bit.
Right.
But he tweeted out an AI generated image of Taylor Swift wearing "Make America Great Again" hat.
Yes.
And she hadn't like officially like come out and said anything really about the election at that point. So after that was out there, she said, "Listen, no, I'm not."
I mean, she corrected really what
essentially
what was put out there.
Yeah, she said, "I'm not a supporter. I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris," and you know that's that, you know. And
in that way, I really think that they're entitled to their opinions. I mean, they're just people.
Absolutely.
Just because people listen to them one way or the other, you know, they are entitled to their opinion.
Have you ever heard anything from a celebrity, and has it changed any way you think about a subject or a topic?
I've never been influenced necessarily by a celebrity. I think I've been turned off by celebrities that I loved.
Okay.
Not really political, but just like opinions that I was like, oh, that doesn't really jive with me. I've never been swayed, I don't think. I don't think.
Right. You don't know, though. It could be
Well, I think that whatever I believed already, probably, like, you know, they like kind of justified my feelings.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I think, you know, if you like a celebrity, you probably agree with a lot of things they say.
Yes,
even, you know, beyond that, you know, we mentioned John Lennon. I'm a big Beatle fan. They're very, you know, we're always more liberal. All you need is love. Give peace a chance. All that kind of stuff. So they kind of, I don't know if listening to them influenced me to make me who I am, but I definitely am along the same lines as them in terms of some of the things I feel about things like that.
But I don't think that they might have, I don't think they swayed you. I think you had that underlying, because I know someone who was a big Beatles fan, huge, like John Lennon was, you know, the king, and opposite of everything that John Lennon, you know, in his beliefs, he even says if he's still alive, I don't know if I would agree with him. He'd probably have jumped
Interesting.
ship.
Yeah. I mean, again, people in the past too are kind of locked into whatever they were at one time. So, you know, we don't know what would John Lennon be saying right now. We don't know.
I would love to know.
It would be probably pretty funny because he was, you know, he definitely was irreverent with a lot of the stuff that he did. And it was he definitely would have had opinions because he was not shy about giving those opinions. But I do want to kind of go back even a little bit further to some old school people who protested. And again, these are probably what you would think of maybe as the generation before in terms of actors and performers. Humphrey Bogart.
Oh, yeah. What was he?
He was very outspoken against Joseph McCarthy. Of course, the McCarthy hearings in the 50s. And a lot of people were blacklisted because they were labeled communists by Senator Joe McCarthy. And there was, what's interesting is one of the people who stood up against Joe McCarthy and said this isn't right was an actor by the name of Ron Reagan. Who he eventually went into politics on his own. And, you know, very interesting. We're going to have to do one on Ronald Reagan, too, because he is such an amazing...
So interesting,
an amazing individual and a celebrity.
Yeah.
He was an actor. That's what he got started. He was Bedtime for Bonzo. He was the Gipper. He did, you know, all these movies in the 40s and 50s and into the 60s. And then,
which, by the way, I wonder if people who were around then when he was an actor and then saw him become president feel that way, like we feel maybe about Donald Trump being like on The Apprentice and then the president.
Right. You know.
Like kids might not know that, but like seeing that transition.
Right.
Wow.
It is interesting. And again, it's an excellent point you make about Donald Trump. He was a businessman and, had success in real estate and casinos and all that kind of stuff. But he's a celebrity.
Yeah, for sure.
Even before The Apprentice, he was on the Howard Stern show. He was on Letterman. Yeah. He was on all the Late Show. And he always kind of had his spiel. He had the beauty pageants and all this kind of stuff. He was very much, and still is in a lot of ways, a showman. So it's interesting to hear him kind of pushing back, like, oh, these people. He was on all these talk shows. He hosted Saturday Night Live a couple of times.
Right.
And it's very interesting that again, I'm not going to psychoanalyze Donald Trump because I don't know if anybody could really do that and understand because he's his own thing by a long stretch. But I do kind of think he might feel like he's been a little shunned by Hollywood because he was one of them.
Right.
And they haven't taken him in as one of their own.
Yeah. And maybe he thought he was in the club, once you're in.
It's almost like he was kicked out by the cool kids and now he's like really annoyed by it.
Right.
It's a fascinating story, but I do want to talk about a couple of other interesting ones. Eartha Kitt, who was a singer and a performer. Probably, I know her best as she was one of the Catwomen on the old Batman TV show in the 60s.
Yeah.
She was invited to a dinner at the White House in the 60s when Lyndon Johnson was the president.
Okay.
And it was just like, they were having some celebrities there for whatever it was. And she basically got up and talked to Lyndon Johnson saying, you got to end this war. You got to bring our boys home. And that did not go over well with Lyndon Johnson because it was
really?
She kind of,
She overstepped?
Yeah, she overstepped. It wasn't supposed to be that kind of thing. It was supposed to be just a happy little meet and greet. And she's like, no, this is wrong and you should do it. And again, she was doing it in the White House at a White House dinner.
I guess it was publicized in the newspaper.
I think you can find clips of it on YouTube. Where she very famously, and I can't do an Eartha Kitt impersonation, but she had a very I can't do it, but she had a very distinct speaking voice, and she said, "President Johnson, bring our boys home," and it's kind of like a famous quote of hers. The other person is Marlon Brando. And very, very, very strange fellow, Marlon Brando.
Yes.
But he stood up for a lot of different causes, was very idealistic, and
he shunned the Academy Awards. I remember that. I don't remember why though.
Yeah, he won for The Godfather.
Yeah.
And I believe it was 1973. And he won the Oscar, and he didn't show up, and he sent a Native American woman to accept the award for her and to basically say that, the Native Americans were being screwed over by the government. They had their land taken away, which is very historically accurate. And what's interesting is John Wayne, who was very politically active on the right side of things, was there and had to be held back from going and dragging her off stage. He was behind stage. Apparently, this is the story. I mean, I don't know how true any of this is, but it is. So I do want to talk about, most of these people we've talked about are liberal, but there are a few people on the right side too. It definitely skews more to the left and Democratic and liberal than to the right and Republican.
I think it's tough to be in Hollywood and be conservative because you're.
But there is this whole group of celebrities now who basically, and I'm going to use Scott Baio as the example, who was Chachi on Happy Days, and Charles in Charge, I think, was a show he was on too in the 90s, and
he was like a heartthrob.
He was like a heartthrob in the late 70s, early 80s, and hasn't done a lot of work since. Definitely hasn't done anything major since.
Yes.
And so he's a Trump supporter, and he will go on Fox News and talk about things. And why are we listening to Chachi talk about political debate? It's kind of a bizarre kind of thing, but they do put him on because here's a Hollywood guy who likes Trump.
They're trying
and again, there's not many of those, but there is also part of that. And John Voight, very outspoken, James Woods, very outspoken supporter. There are others, of course, but what's interesting, is this group, and I wouldn't put John Voight or James Woods because they have very successful careers, but there's this group of actors who had mediocre careers and haven't worked in a long time.
Right.
And say, well, now I'm shunned by Hollywood because I'm a Trump supporter. And it's like, well, you really haven't worked in like 40 years.
Right.
So,
Not sure that tipped the scale.
I'm not sure that probably wouldn't help you right now, but you were kind of forgotten about for a long time, And maybe the only reason people are even hearing your name now is because of this.
Yeah, it was a good idea to just jump on the bandwagon.
Right. I mean, it's so I don't think they're being oppressed all that much.
No.
But
I don't think so.
Yeah, but that is.
I do think that maybe some conservative people in Hollywood don't speak about their personal political
probably
views.
Not.
Probably.
And
I would say that's more the norm of the mainstream Hollywood working people.
Right. A good example of that is Chris Pratt, who is big time actor in the Marvel movies, Parks and Recreation, and a very likable guy. A very, very, and I don't really know his political leanings, but he is very religious. Right. So you do tend to associate very religious people with the right. Right. Obviously, there's a lot of political positions that lean that way in terms of like abortion and same-sex marriage and all that kind of stuff, that if you're a staunch religious type, you might not be in favor of those things. But and he does say, "Hey, I'm a religious guy," but he doesn't really go too out there with it. And he's just like, you know what, I'm going to do my movies and be
and
charming.
Not political, maybe, and maybe he doesn't like anyone in political office. That could be too.
That is always possible too.
I was actually curious about Angelina Jolie because her father, Jean Voight. Not that they don't get along, but she's very active, with humanitarian efforts and things. But she doesn't speak about politics. Right. No, she doesn't get too political. No. Neither does Brad Pitt too, even when they were together. They just kind of do whatever they do. But like you said, they do have causes. There's these causes are probably would make you think they lean to the left, just like I said, Chris Pratt, his religious leanings might make you think it's not necessarily true. No, I don't think so. But
it's but you would tend to think
that's the stereotype for sure.
more than likely.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about one thing that is kind of heavy about all this. Is when you talk about when conservatives or right-wing people talk about Hollywood, the liberal elite, the Hollywood elite, there is an undertone, whether it's intentional or not, of anti-Semitism.
Oh, really?
Because there's a whole theory that most of the people who run Hollywood are Jews. The Jews run Hollywood. Mel Gibson very famously said that when he was pulled over by the police. And there is, people who feel that way. Yeah. See, I never would put that connection together. It's almost like they're talking in code. Like the Hollywood elite, is maybe this is elite because they're part of this Jewish elite. Right. Again, it gets that's getting very deep, and maybe I don't think people are thinking about it quite as much, but there is an undertone of that. I think that might have been in the past, but I think now everything is kind of up in the air with the war and everything, that you can't really, you don't really know which, I'm not sure. Right. I'm a little bit more optimistic than that. All right, I'll give you that one. Pessimistic view, but yeah. I'll give you that one. No, I'll give you that one, But yeah, I understand what you're saying. Or for sure, at some point, that might have been, a big thing. Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's definitely, obviously when you go back, anti-Semitism has been around for centuries. So, this is nothing new. But, right, exactly. But, it is definitely, it does seem like almost like they're talking in code. Like, when people talk about immigrants, maybe they're talking about minorities. They're not necessarily. So it's it's very there is that part of it. So, what celebrity do you think is the most interesting when they talk about like political stuff? Who's the one like do I like or or not necessarily like or just find interesting? Well, I have to say that the best celebrity quote, and sometimes when they're not Americans, you give them people look at them differently. But Bono, I love when people are smart and just they just give the right zing without being insulting. Right. So did you hear Bono's response to the boss? Yes, I believe it was. There's only one boss in the U.S. Yeah, and that was it. That's all he had to say. I think he was on Kimmel, and he just said that, and that was it.
He bailed, but it was the perfect kind of, just like a nugget of truth or whatever.
Right. And, and like a lot of the things we've talked about, when somebody says something, like Kimmel is a great example because Donald Trump hates Jimmy Kimmel. Mm-hmm. And Jimmy Kimmel does a lot of material. It's a late night talk show, so he gets a lot of material from Donald Trump. And Trump will respond to Kimmel's monologue.
Like the way we were saying.
Call him out, which is, maybe you should be focusing on other things. Like why? It's stunning to me that he cares so much, but he does seem to care about the criticism. About he'll say Saturday Night Live is awful, it's terrible, it's the worst show ever, and it's these texts that are all in these tweets that are all in caps and calling people idiots and calling them names and making up names. He's incredibly thin-skinned,
right? Yeah,
when it comes to this kind of stuff, and so obviously the people who are pushing against him are going to do it more.
Right.
But also that seems to reinforce the people who support him.
Right.
Because they're
attacking him.
Right. Because, the deranged Trump syndrome, they call it that. Like, people are just obsessed with him. And it's hard not to be obsessed with him because he's running the country right now.
Exactly. That's true.
You do have to pay attention to him. It's fascinating. But when you look back at other presidents and, we'll single out another Republican right now, George W. Bush. Mm-hmm. People made fun of him a lot.
Yes, he didn't care,
and he didn't care. He just he's like he would joke about it. He would make he would make references to it. He had this, and I don't think this is entirely true, but people thought he was maybe not the brightest person to be president. And that was kind of like what the comedians kind of beat him up on.
Oh, yeah, constantly. I don't think he ever even addressed it.
Right.
In his whole presidency.
Yeah. And if he did, it was very tongue-in-cheek and kind of in a clever way, to his credit. Yeah, to his credit, kind of thing. And Dana Carvey, who was on Saturday Night Live, of course, for years in the 90s, and impersonated George Bush Sr., the first George Bush.
Yes.
Did an amazing impersonation. Will Ferrell did a great George W. Bush, but Dana Carvey did a great George Bush Sr. when he was president. George Bush invited him to the White House. And very famously, Dana Carvey tells this story all the time whenever you see interviews with him. He had him call his secretary from the intercom in the Oval Office. He had Dana Carvey call his secretary and say, "Hey, can you come in here?" I can't really do a George Bush impersonation either. And the secretary thought it was the president.
No way, that's awesome.
That's pretty cool. And again, he had fun with it.
Yeah,
he just you can make fun of. You're supposed to make fun of politicians.
Of course, they're always going to make fun. Reagan, they made so much fun of Ronald Reagan. Remember that? I think
absolutely.
And he just didn't address it.
When Saturday Night Live first started in the 70s, Gerald Ford was the president, and Chevy Chase did Gerald Ford impersonation, which was not an impersonation at all because Chevy Chase looks nothing like Gerald Ford. Didn't sound like him. The big joke was he would always fall down.
Oh,
because Gerald Ford had a reputation. He tripped on camera a couple of times. So he kind of got this reputation that he was kind of klutzy. And I think that may have ruined his political career because he wasn't reelected. And it was basically just kind of like that became the image of Gerald Ford.
Oh, yeah. You don't want someone to lose their footing on the world stage.
Exactly. That he was kind of like this klutzy, doofy kind of guy. And what's interesting about Gerald Ford is he was actually an athlete in college. He was like he could have been like a pro football player. He was like really good. He was a model, which you wouldn't think looking at pictures of Gerald Ford when he was president, but he actually like modeled clothing for like magazines and stuff. So he was probably at one time was kind of a dashing, suave kind of guy, but the caricature of him became kind of a doofball.
Oh.
So it definitely.
How did he take that?
He was pretty good about it. He joked about it, but I do think it might have hurt him in the long run. And again, this was in the 70s when media was very different than it is now.
Yes, right. So now image is a whole different ballgame now. I mean, it just doesn't seem to matter.
Right. None of it matters. If we could leave you with one note here today, it would be that none of it matters.
Exactly.
Thank you for listening to The Last Radio Show. If you like the show, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review on your favorite platform. You can check us out on Facebook and Instagram at The Last Radio Show. We will talk to you soon.
The Last Radio Show.
The Last Radio Show.